So what we're going to do, we've been talking about kind of like one side of the coin this whole time. And it's just been filtering traffic and firewalling it and hoping that, bad things don't come through. So at a certain point, though, we need some kind of insight as to what's really going on. So we can make all the firewall rules in the world, but that doesn't help us figure out what is really going on, like inside of our network, or even what's going on at the border of our network. Or oftentimes, usually the really, really curious one is, what are our servers doing? That's usually a really, really important one to figure out. Like, this particular server keeps trying to go out to the internet. Can we try to figure out what it's really actually doing aside from just blindly going out to the internet? So in order to do stuff like that, we need to do logs, right? We have to review log files. Aside from poking around inside of the interface, like the Palo Alto has a nice display for searching out individual logs. The Juniper one really doesn't have a good interface for loading up a log. You can do it, but it's not so pretty. So aside from doing that, we haven't done a lot about that. So what kind of information can we figure out from log files? Yeah, so we start to so everything that we did up till now, right? We can troubleshoot and go through logs. Sometimes it's tricky to figure out what the logs really mean, but if we're dropping packets when you're trying to get a firewall rule to let stuff through, then that's your indicator of, hey, it's working or not working in a way that I expect. And that's great, right? If you think about the time that a firewall person is going to invest, how much time are they going to actually invest reviewing logs for that particular purpose?
For troubleshooting?
Yeah.
I do a lot of troubleshooting, so.
Well, you're tinkering with your firewall a lot, though, right? How about if we look at DSU?
Pretty much never.
Yeah, we don't review our logs for at least this particular purpose, because are we making, is our firewall configuration a fluid one that's changing by the end? No. It's pretty much set up, and I look at actually the config changes as they come through, and it's like we've renamed some object in there, and that's like the exciting thing, or we renamed a rule. That's an exciting change in our firewall. So we're not doing a ton of troubleshooting with our logs. So what do we do the rest of the time? When we have all of these logs and stuff getting generated, why do we care about any of that data? Yeah, we'll look for some sort of anomaly. Or something bizarre. Yeah, weird stuff going on, right? So, yeah, and that maybe not necessarily even has to be like a problem, right? We could just review and be like, oh, this sort of thing's going on now, or this service is running over on this IP address. So the next problem that we then get is, especially in the case of our lab, where were the logs stored at? On the device, right? The logs for the Palo are on the Palo. If we did some stuff in the command line in the system syslog section of the config, we could have firewall logs being written to a log file on the Juniper box. That's spiffy, except for what? A couple problems with that. I mean, it's great that they're stored somewhere, right? But what's the problem with all of our logs just being stored on the devices? Yeah, we get two huge problems. First one is, in order for me to review the logs of our Palo Alto firewall that we had in class, I have to log into the Palo Alto firewall. If I wanted to review the logs of the Juniper device, I would have to SSH into it or something like that and review the log files on that device. In the case of our homework or our lab, is that a huge deal? Not so much, because there's two devices, right? So when we start to look at security events, are our firewalls the only devices that have security events related on them? No. What other devices could we have? Yeah, basically anything, right? We could have switches. If we have, I don't know how many of you have attempted or just plugged into the wired network on campus. Generally speaking, you have to authenticate to that. That's a security event that could be relevant to us. Even simple things like, we issued you a DHCP address. That could be a security event that we now can tie that IP address to you. So we have lots and lots of devices scattered all over that have security events on them. Then the second problem was, how long does it retain for? In the case of like DSU's big firewall, DSU has a lot of traffic going through, so our firewall itself can only hold about 2 days worth of data. What do we do after 2 days? Yeah, we start to overwrite the oldest data so that we keep the same amount of space and everything's happy. So there's that problem. And then there's another problem of, let's say, worst case scenario, we've had a compromise. Someone got into our stuff. What's one of the primary things that an attacker does when they are inside of a network? Assuming they want to remain and they're good at what they're doing. They've created some sort of backdoor and wipe their trace, right? Get rid of their trails. So if our attackers, somehow compromised our firewall or something like that, the first thing they're going to try to do is erase the logs that are pertinent to them, so that after the fact we don't have something to go back and review. So that's going to be a problem. So this is where we get our fun term, and this is actually, the stuff we're doing is going actually through the first 2 chapters of our book, which I forgot to give everyone a heads up of. So log aggregation, we're taking all of this data from all of these different devices and putting it in one central pile. So there's obvious reasons why we want to do that, right? Get rid of erasing old stuff, because it's a lot easier for me to throw a bunch of hard drives in a server that's storing logs, as opposed to, I don't know how many of you have walked up to a firewall with a hard drive and been like, yeah, you want this? And the firewall's like, no, I don't want that. So that's a reason. And if we have someone in there that's trying to erase their tracks, not saying they can't do it, but it's a lot harder, because now not only are you going to try to erase the tracks out of the firewall, but now you have to try to find where the data is being sent to and get there too. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is getting this data moved around and getting it in the right place. And then there's also what data is important. Do you think every piece of information our firewall generates is relevant to us? No. If we looked at the raw stream, I think at one point DSU's firewall was kicking out 14 gigabytes of data a day. Now we have a lot of traffic and a lot of network events and stuff like that, but our firewall has a lot of data it's generating, like simple things such as allocated this block of memory. Do I care about that data? No, that's just internally the firewall working. So there's also another reason why we need to do log aggregation. Because someday you're going to be working in an area that has the almighty regulation applied to it. So where do these regulations come from? Yeah, government or whoever is overseeing you, right? It's a good time. So there's 3 primary ones. Anyone know what SOX is? Yep, Sarbanes-Oxley. What's that one regulating? Okay. Something finance, yeah. Banks and corporations, this is what SOX is after. So, SOX is one of those that's kind of we've had people in the past trying to erase traces of data and whatnot. So that's a problem if you're a regulated or corporation. So kind of a big deal. we get into the fun politics of a publicly held company. So what's a publicly held company?
They have shares on the stock market.
Yeah, there's shares on the stock market, and even if I started the publicly held company, I'm not necessarily the one that owns it, right? There's people that own multiple shares of it. That's a problem when it comes to regulation and stuff, because if, in the case of like publicly held companies, if I decide I want a new house, I can't take the company checkbook and write a check for my new house. If I have a private company that I just own myself, is that so much of a big deal? No, because it's my company. It is, in the end, my money. I mean, I probably still wouldn't buy the house that way, but either way, you could do it, and you're not going to, like, go to jail. But in the case of publicly held companies, you will go to jail for dipping out of the company coffer. So SOX has all sorts of regulations on that. PCI is a really fun one. PCI is one that probably, for sure, everyone is going to encounter some sort of PCI. PCI is going to give you a hug someday. So PCI regulation applies to businesses that do what?
Store credit card information.
Yeah, and not necessarily even store it, even just transmitting it. So like DSU, we don't store credit card data here, but we still transmit it. So we've got all sorts of PCI love that we've had to abide by. That's why you'll notice, what's a random example? Actually, if we go to DakotaCon and try to register for a training, sure, let's do this one. Well, it doesn't matter. It takes us to this website. We fill it out. Goats, cats, ASDF.com, 8675 309. Oh, we need an area code, 605. So we review the order. Notice we're still at DSU's website. We go to checkout. And what does DSU do? DSU says we want no part of handling this credit card transaction. So that's how DSU maintains our PCI compliance is we're shipping it off to somebody else. It's their problem. What's the downside to this for DSU?
Can't do scrape for information.
Yeah, it's a little tougher for us to scrape your credit card information. There is that.
Probably have to pay the middleman.
Yeah, we have to pay the middleman a little bit more. So since we're handing this transaction off, it costs us a little bit more per transaction. But in the grand scheme of things, we're talking like maybe we pay, I have no idea, maybe we pay 5% to authorize.net instead of paying 1.5% if we processed it on our own. So 5% here costs more to process this transaction, but what's the downside if we have to be PCI compliant? The downside is we have to be PCI compliant, which that's tricky to do. So there's that. They require logs and everything like that to be stored centrally, and then HIPAA, what's that one do for us? Healthcare goodies. So in the healthcare world, if you have PHI, so what is it, primary healthcare information or personal healthcare information? I forget what PHI actually stands for. But that can be something as simple as me, even say I'm your athletic trainer at DSU, and you sprain your wrist, and I emailed a chiropractic clinic, that is actually a PHI, a HIPAA violation. Because is email a secure mechanism for transmitting data? No. In the end, it's a sprained wrist, so you'd be like, who cares? But that's a problem. So in the end, all of these regulations give us lots of big hugs for making things really hard to do. But they're there for a reason. One of the big things behind all of these is now these regulations are starting to come out and say, you need to centrally store all of the data about what's going on your network. So they're actually putting in regulations saying you have to do the central aggregation. So, how many of you have heard of syslog? A couple of you have? What's syslog do? Yeah, kinda. So syslog used to actually be like a way of delivering messages back and forth, kind of like a pre-SMTP thing, is sort of how it was originally made. Then we determined this was a really silly way to do email. So what syslog is it's just a mechanism for delivering information back and forth. But it's super stripped down, super lightweight, and it's meant to just deliver events about stuff on a network, or not necessarily on or about the network, but it uses the network to actually get it done. So that's what it is. It is a pretty standard thing. If you get any sort of network gear ever, there's going to be syslog in it for you to configure to send log data off. The only thing you will ever encounter that does not have syslog is, guess what? The drum roll of Windows. Yeah, Windows is like, well, no, we don't want to do syslog. That would be terrible. But there's all sorts of, and I suppose technically Linux, you have to add a syslog client to send the data off. But still, all of these are devices that can generate syslog data. And in the case of Windows, there are people that have made event log to syslog, like clients or agents that run on a computer to ship the logs off. So syslog has like a couple standard things that it does, but none of those standards like apply to the actual data it sends. The standard stuff that syslog has is UDP 514. That's the port that it runs on, but you can configure it to run on other ports. That's just the normal thing for it to run on. And there are basically two codes inside of syslog, two numbers. Otherwise, everything else is up to syslog. So there's a facility and a severity code. So the facility code is basically saying, here is a vague type of message that the device is sending, and the severity code is, guess what? What's severity going to tell you? Yeah, like, is this just a casual message that you can ignore and just go back through debugging, or is this a critical, like, set off a pager kind of thing? Because everyone carries a pager around now, right? So on that token, I went to it was a Stampede game this weekend, and I saw a guy wearing a beeper. Yeah, for real. He had a beeper. Yeah. So, in the end, there's a problem with this. If all we're standardizing is a vague code that tells where it came from and how severe it is, the actual data inside of the syslog, like the information that we pass alongside of the packet, the format of that is totally up to the vendor. So, and the vendor being like whoever made, is implementing syslog. So what problem does that maybe make for us? Yes, so we can get all of the data we ever want. What if we have more than one vendor sending us data? What problem are we going to run into? The data is going to be all formatted differently. Some syslog vendors for, say, a firewall will send us a data stream that the first part of, say, if we were just doing syslog on firewall rules, if we allowed or blocked traffic, we'll say block IP port going to IP port. Others are going to start with rule name IP port, IP port. Others aren't going to use ports. They're going to use, in the case of both the Juniper and the Palo Alto firewall, could you ever, when you were making a firewall rule, just type in a port number? Or what did you have to pick? Say if you wanted to allow port 80 to go through for web traffic on the Juniper firewall, you'd have to pick the Junos HTTP thing, right? So when a lot of devices send syslog data, it won't even have a port number. It'll say Junos HTTP inside of it. So if we're sitting there trying to figure out, here's a log from a firewall going to a router inside of the network hitting a web server, putting them all together, well, they're all calling it different stuff. Or, God forbid, we have two different firewall vendors that the packet has to go through. They're going to label that traffic totally differently. So when we sit down and we have this like spreadsheet of data, you ever gotten a spreadsheet where like the columns were off? Or there's like a row in the spreadsheet shifted over 3 columns or something and it just ruins everything? That's how syslog works. They're like, oh, you'd like to put this in a theoretical spreadsheet? Well, good luck, because none of it's going to be the same. What other kind of devices could we do syslog on? Servers? That's a good one. Switches and routers. So I made a list of the things that I have done syslog with in my little, I don't know, entourage. Yeah, for real. So if you actually think about, there's some of this sounds really stupid, right? Security cameras, or doors, right? Or even just motion sensors. So when we look at actually building control systems, there's a couple ways we can do it. If we have, say, DSU, let's just take a bank, because it's going to be hard to apply this to DSU. If you walk through a bank, you will notice little white motion sensors mounted all over the walls. What are those there for? Yeah. It usually, those can be used to turn on a certain type of light. So generally, what happens is there's a door sensor triggered saying we just saw this door open. It could be because someone inserted a key, or I swiped my badge in the outside door and the HID reader clicked and the door opened. So we know the door opened. And then we saw motion, so someone entered. Then usually in a bank, I suppose not many of you have unlocked a bank branch before, have you? So the next thing that usually starts happening is you've triggered the door sensor and the motion sensors in the entryway. You now have to go disarm the security system. So you go up to the pin pad, enter your pin, and then usually banks are divided up into zones. So like the lobby is a zone, the office area is a zone, the teller areas is a zone, like on the other side of the counter. The vault will be its own zone. And usually there's motion sensors inside of the ATMs. That's another zone. And they can divide it up into even more crazy categories too. So, like in the case of me, being a mere IT guy, I was not allowed or could not disable the security system for the vault, because I had no business being in there, or the ATMs. I could go back in the teller area or wherever, because there's computers in there and maybe he needs to go fix something. I don't know. So when we put in these sort of systems, there's a couple ways they can be designed. One is, which is pretty common, all of these things from the motion sensor to the door sensor, they all have their own proprietary communication system. So like there's a couple DC wires running to it to power it with whatever 12 volts of DC goodness to keep it on, and then there's just a signal wire coming back to some magical circuit board that's just looking for signals coming off it. That's one way, which they can all be designed. What else could we do? Instead of running weird wiring to all of this, what if we just run a network drop up to that motion sensor that's up there? So, can we power something with a motion drop? Or with a motion drop? With a network drop?
Sure can.
Sure you can. You use PoE, right? Power over Ethernet. And if we just give this motion sensor an IP address, the motion sensor could now send syslog data saying, hey, I see motion. There's a whole standard network protocol out there for just sending data back and forth. Cameras can do the same thing. DSU's security cameras all around can send syslog data of like, it's too dark, I can't see, or there's motion here, or my SD card is full, or all sorts of stuff like that. So tons and tons of different reasons. So anyway, there's standard protocols for doing event notification across here, and it's syslog. So all of these have different purposes, right? Switches, firewalls, routers, network hardware obviously needs to send some sort of network events going on. So servers do too. How about what would a power conditioning unit be? Like what?
It's a AC.
Not like conditioning AC power. You mean? Or like air conditioning?
No, I meant air.
Oh, no.
Air.
Yeah, so have you ever plugged in certain devices and there's a buzz? Or like if you plug in a speaker, you turn the speaker on, there's no signal going into it, and you get a brrr in the background? That usually means there's essentially interference on the power line coming into the device. So DSU has power conditioners that sit and filter out all the junk before it comes into our data center. If there's a problem with one of those, do we want to know? Yes. If there's a problem with the devices that are, being the source of electricity coming in, we'd like to know right now. So that's one. Uninterruptible power supplies, UPS, backup batteries, stuff like that. Desktop computers can have all sorts of events like a user logged in. That's relevant, right? And cameras have all sorts of stuff. Lights can do, depending on how fancy your light is, of like the brightness has changed or something like that. A lot of green lights will actually have light sensors on them and try to set an ambient level. Doors being like, hey, a door open, HVAC, like we can actually run thermostats off of syslog, so the thermostats will phone home and say, hey, the temperature is currently this. Storage and backup, so like a hard drive died, or the tape is dead. Those are relevant things for networked devices to send back to us. So with all of these things, that's where we can start to see the big picture of like, there's not a standard way to push data into syslog, right? If we made a standard way for all of the firewalls of the world, well, what happens when, I don't know, FortiGate has some new thing they want to log on their firewall? Well, they have to break the rules then. Or if we make all syslog stuff for firewalls, well, what's the motion sensor going to do? So there's that. And when we think about the different kinds of events, this is just a magical little list that I made up. So this is just lists of things that just a firewall could tell us. So someone logged into the firewall, like an admin came in, a particular service spun up or shut down, like a web interface was turned on or turned off, or VPN services were turned on or turned off. The disk on the firewall, most firewalls have hard drives in them now, it seems like, is getting full. That's going to be a problem. We're out of memory or the CPU's maxed out. That's something that if we're a netadmin, we want to know. If interfaces are coming up and down on a firewall, that's something to maybe be concerned about, right? Should interfaces be flapping on a firewall? Flapping is the technical term for an interface that keeps coming up and down. It's not actually a technical term, it's just what people call it. Maybe it is technical, I don't know. Or the official term. This is my current Palo Alto fun of every 6 hours I get an alert that says, hey, the fan is super dead. I'm like, I know it's super dead. Thanks for the update. It's been super dead for a while. But we have other Palo Alto, like, actually to go into that saga, my replacement device for the dead fan. If I got a new firewall, I actually am getting a new firewall to replace the new firewall because the new one was broke and doesn't work. So I have now RMA'd my RMA device. So we're still running off firewall to dead fan. So there's that. Why would power supply voltage change?
Power surges.
Could be something crazy like a power surge. There's usually only 2 different voltages that a power supply is going to read.
There's no power.
Yeah, there could be none or some. It's kind of one of those deals. This is more relevant to like you have a dual power supply deal, and it's actually funny that like the Juniper firewall won't send me an alert that says this power supply is offline or is like lost power. It sends an alert. They're like, detected voltage is null. Like, what? And that was when there's like a leg of power in the data center went out because they were doing battery changes and stuff like that. But I'm like, okay, the voltage is null. I guess that works. And then there's after all of that, there's just the basic ones like, hey, we denied or allowed this traffic, or sessions are coming up, stuff like that. So when we talk about the codes or the actual numbers that can be in there, the things that are standard is a facility code. So the facility codes, there's actually 8, 9 more that are just like custom 0, custom 1, custom 2, custom 3. So you can see that this was kind of made, and then we were like, well, we're not really sure. Generally speaking, like for network devices and whatnot, it's pretty much always a user level message. What kind of kernel message could we ever receive? Or do you ever want your kernel to be sending you alarms? No, you usually don't. There's really only one instance in which you're going to get an alarm from your kernel, and guess what that is? I'm dying. Yeah, like this show's over with. That's usually the only message you're going to get from your kernel. So you usually don't want those. Generally speaking, that's why everything is usually a user level message. If we keep going through here though, like when we talk about mail systems, so this is back from when syslog was actually used as email. So you'd send UDP packets of data and we would piece together messages and stuff like that. Lots of other stuff in here, like the network news protocol, something that you don't see used super often. So the standard facility codes aren't super busy. The next one is the severity codes, which range from 0 to 7. So like the kernel dying would probably be a 0 level alarm, right? All the way alert, critical error, warning, notice, informational, and debugging. So usually we don't really care about debug messages. So the one entity of the world that might care about a debug message off a network device. Or the one type of technologist that wants debug level data. Developers, yeah. Developers are usually the ones that are going to care about that. IT people generally aren't going to care about debug level messages because debug level messages are like all the way down to I'm allocating 12 bytes of memory right now. I don't care about that in the firewall. That is a level of information that I do not want. So if you usually turn on debug mode logging, you will find that you'll probably like insta-fill log files really fast. So most like firewall events are going to fall in the notice category of like, hey, just an FYI, we dropped this packet. Is that a critical thing to the firewall's operation? No. So the other one I actually found, I don't remember where I read this from, but it was a good example of using the severity codes of syslog in a thermostat. So the debug level thing in our thermostat is going to be like, hey, we just updated the NTP time. For the operation of a thermostat, do we care about that? No, we don't care about the thermostat's clock, right? Informational stuff is going to be like, hey, the system's booting up, FYI. But a general notice would be like your thermostat's just phoning home every 30 seconds saying it's 53 degrees right now or it's 54 degrees or whatever. Let's say your thermostat is set at 50 degrees and it suddenly drops below. That's a warning. Is that super critical? No, if your thermostat's set at 50 degrees and it's cold out, it might end up dropping to 49 or 48 before everything, the furnace kicks in, gets stuff warmed back up. So not a big deal. If it starts to drop really low, we start escalating the level of errors. And then critical, why would a 33 set like a critical alarm through syslog?
That's freezing.
Yeah, we're getting like close to critical levels. And then when we hit alert is like, that's a problem when our thermostat's at 32 degrees. The idea behind this is what we do with these. That's the point. So debug level stuff we probably don't even collect. Informational, we probably like write to a log file somewhere on a server and review it if there's a problem with the thermostat. We would go do that. Notice information is like, that might be information that our database or maybe the furnace is interested in, just kind of day-to-day operational stuff. Then when we start going along here, like, let's say we've received 2 warnings in a day. Do we care? Probably not. If we received 30 warnings in a day, that's starting to get, kind of a big deal. If we get 2 errors in a day, do we care? Probably. If we get a critical, number 2 level severity, that's we need to activate somebody's pager, their beeper, right? So fire off the beeper to alarm them of something. So that's what it's basically used for. Like maybe a level 3 is we send an email. A level 2 is like a text message is generated. And a level 1 alarm is there's an automated call system that starts calling a phone tree of people because like something's bad going on. And then 0 is like also not so good. So in the DevOpsy world, this is super, super important information, and there is actually structures put in place. So the DevOps being like, we're writing code to actually manage our infrastructure, like if we're on Amazon or something like that, and our monitoring systems checking into stuff. In the world of administration, you never want to get a call that's your own voice, like, this is a call from the alert notification system saying something super broke. Because you usually have to, it's funny that you have to record the message that you're called with. But usually that's how those systems work. So in the case of a firewall, we come up to an emergency level thing of like, there's going to be a kernel panic kind of deal, or this is the last part of a kernel panic happening is sending out a syslog event. Alert, like we're at 100% memory use, that's a problem. There's going to be issues with the firewall. More critical, but like can still stay alive of we've ran out of ephemeral ports. What happens when your firewall runs out of ephemeral ports? No new connections can happen, right? The tubes get tough to use. They get clogged. Errors are like someone's trying to come in with a bad username and password for the admin account. Is a couple of errors a day a big deal? Probably not, because that's probably just someone fat fingering their password. 1,200 errors within a period of a minute. That's a different story, right? Then going all the way up further. So do we care a lot if a firewall can't look up a DNS thing? Not really, but it could be a sign of like, why can't it? I mean, we don't care that much, but why couldn't it contact the DNS server? Notices are going to be packets are blocked, just casual day-to-day stuff, then going so on and so forth. So that's like, again, we don't care about debug information. I don't need a firewall or a router to tell me it received a fragmented packet. That's good to go. Allocate some memory, and away we go. So then, of course, with anything that's been standardized, then you have your list of vendors that don't follow the standard, which in the case of a firewall, that's kind of okay. So Palo Alto just does critical, high, medium, low, because at a certain point you just don't need that many different categories. So what they do is inside of their system, they have like a threat classification sort of thing, and it's usually signature based and whatnot, but that's where they get high, medium, and low sort of information. Configuration, like a new configuration has been sent. Do we need to alarm people? No, that's just informational. So that's where they kind of break apart and do stuff. So because of all of the non-standardized stuff, we have to process all this data that comes in because we have tons and tons of data flowing in really, really, really fast, and we have to process it in some way to actually figure out some sort of conclusion about it. To figure out, like, this is a firewall, like, blocking traffic versus this is a firewall that just had a kernel panic, right? Even as much as the severity codes help us out, we still have to know what the message actually says. So this is where once we have done some sort of like normalization of data. What's normalizing do? So that's probably actually a better term for here. We'll just say normalize.
Patterns?
Yeah, we basically take unstructured data like the Juniper and the Palo Alto firewall, format their firewall events differently. So we take all of their crazy formats and then we say, okay, this is the IP address field. This is the port field. Like, we actually standardize it all so that it looks the same. Even though it's from two different vendors, in the end, a blocked packet is just a blocked packet. It doesn't matter who blocked it, right? So that's what normalizing can do for us. So that way we can go and search across all these devices and figure out relevant information. So that's cool. And that's actually what we can do with a couple different products. So if we look at something called Splunk, this has all sorts of data feeds coming into it. So if I go and even just search for like 138.247.115.250, which is the IA lab, we search for that, and Splunk has indexed no results found. Hmm. Well, there are many things, and we see the count off this one firewall is 238 million events. So let's look at it. No results found. You had 238 million events. Right? I wonder if we cooked our license. Oh, yep. So the red bar is what our license allows, and the blue bars is how much data we pumped into this. So the next problem with normalizing data is most of the engines that you do this with charge you by the volume of data they normalize. So DSU has a 10 gig a day license, which is a lot of data. And I knew we exceeded it. I thought they fixed it quicker than that. So we pointed DSU's Palo main firewall to the iLab Splunk server, and I was like, okay, if you be nice. And they apparently weren't. So what Splunk does is if you've been naughty and exceeded your license so many times, you can't search. So, yep. I think it's did you get 5 tries?
Yeah, it looks like.
Which one? Oh, that one. I have clicked on that before. How to avoid it? I don't care. What was the one I clicked on before? Oh, in 2010. If you exceed your deadline, you'll get a warning. Message persists if you have 5 or more violations. And a 30-day period search will be disabled. Oh, so we're going to have a bit. Because we've got quite a few over a 30-day period. So next month, we can look at DSU Splunk. I guess is what we've got. So I guess we're not going to show that then. So...
Is that the only filtering service that you use?
Oh, to index and archive. Now there's just another just bulk dumping of data happening. It's not in a searchable format, but it's in a format that if we know an event happened from this time period to this time period, the cool thing about Splunk is you can actually just drop data files in a folder and it'll just eat it. So the other thing Splunk does in addition to normalizing data is it indexes it. So much like Google, you can just search Google and they have an index of the internet rather than just crawling it. So I could crawl through like, I don't know, I think our Splunk server's probably got like 100 gigs of data, write a query, hit enter, and be like, that IP address has been hit 27 times, and it just pops up instantly. Which would be cool to show, but I guess we're not gonna. So we're gonna figure something out with that. Anywho, the next thing is once we've normalized all the data, that's cool. And that's basically what Splunk is doing for us, is normalizing it all so it's in a standard format. The next one is correlating it. So when we correlate something, what do we do? Any guess? So, yeah, it's kind of figuring out, like, if you go, it's been on Reddit a few different times, there's like ironic correlations. And in the state of Kentucky, the marriage rate, when you plot it on a graph, like exactly follows the same graphs as death by falling out of a boat and drowning. So like the higher the marriage rate, the higher the number of people drown. Now in that instance, are they really probably related? I assume, well, I guess, maybe bad example. I assume not, anyway. So a correlation is finding out like this piece of data over here and that piece of data over there are actually tied together somehow. So if we take like Apache log files, being a web server log, and we take a firewall log saying we allowed this packet through, can we correlate those together? Yeah, because the firewall at some point let the traffic in, right? And that's going to be correlated, and the firewall let it in and logged it. And the Apache server said, hey, I received a GET request from this IP address. Can we tie them together? Yeah. What's the downside to doing that? I mean, from a security standpoint, there's not really a downside. What's our issue in doing that? Because Google and Facebook are really good at correlating data. What does it take to do that? Yeah, like awesome amounts of power and software that's very, very expensive. So that's why Google's a big company with lots and lots of developers, because they're cranking out software that's correlating all sorts of data. Now, in the case of Google, what are they correlating? Like, if you search for switches, maybe I'm going to throw you up a switch ad because you must be interested in buying a switch, right? Or a router or whatever. That's what Google's correlating it for. And actually, to an extent, that's what Facebook's correlating it for, too. So for us, the number of times an uninteresting thing happened is an interesting thing, right? So what we do is normalize it all, put it all together, and start to look at certain events. Like there was some network traffic from a Windows server at around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The server disappeared. The service went offline. We had alarms. It came back. Is that a huge deal for us? Is that something that we should like call 911 about? Depends on what else happened. What if we look at where the traffic went to? On a Tuesday, where might a Windows server send traffic to? To Microsoft, yeah. So if we see all of a sudden a batch of correlated events where this server generated traffic out to Windows Update on this certain day, and then its disk activity just went up, and then it went offline, we probably figure out that that was Windows updates. Now, that's the tricky bit with this is we as people can put those together, right? Link those pieces. But getting a computer to do it for us is a different story. So this is the other actually cool one. The more data you have, the more like interesting kind of things you can predict. So whenever you buy a big commercial SAN, so you have like hundreds and hundreds of hard drives, usually whoever you buy it from is going to be like, oh, you need to set up this virtual machine that takes all of the data, not like the data on your SAN, but like the management data. This disk is running this fast, this many RPM, so there's this many errors and stuff like that. You need to upload that back to us. And they usually do that because of warranty reasons. So if you think about HP, How many hard drives do you suppose HP is monitoring in the world? Tons, yeah, a bunch, right? I don't have a number. I could make something up. But a bunch, right? So do you suppose HP has a huge enough data set that when they see a certain pattern of CRC errors, which is usually the error you get off a hard drive. You know what a CRC error is? It's a cyclic redundancy check error. It's just a way of doing a checksum that's really, really easy. It's not like a checksum, a hash you'd do for security stuff, because it's like just a 16-bit checksum. But either way, it's good enough to see if data is corrupt on a hard drive. So if we start to see this pattern of like these 12 CRC errors off a hard drive, and smart, what's smart on a hard drive?
It's check.
Yeah, it's like your disk is just reporting its health back to your computer. So if we see these certain parameters come back from smart and we see a couple CRC errors, we might be able to predict, if we're HP and we have billions of hard drives, we can probably say in a month that hard drive's going to fail because we have correlated this pattern of what these disks do. So in the case of like our SANs and stuff at DSU, we usually will get an email or a phone call or something from HP saying, we just took this disk offline, we copied the data off it for you automatically and took it offline. It's still working, the data's moving off. Someone's going to be there tomorrow to replace the disk for you with a new one. So that's cool, right? It's also expensive, but it's better than losing a disk and losing data and stuff like that. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be elite cybersecurity sort of thing, even though actually losing hard drives is a security problem because you don't lose data. So other sort of things like a correlation system could actually take a user's permission, like an Active Directory, and pinpoint what their traffic should look like. So me as an administrator, if I'm a domain admin on a network, is my traffic going to look different than a secretary or an accountant's? Yeah, totally is going to. Should the secretary or the accountant, should he or she ever ping anything? No, right? We wouldn't expect that user to be doing that sort of thing, right? Whereas, do we want to apply that same security policy to me, a domain admin? No, that's going to get super duper annoying because I live with a terminal window open, pinging crap all the time, seeing if something's broke, right? So that being said, though, should me as a domain admin, should I be doing a lot of dinking around on the accounting server? No, that would be abnormal, whereas the accountant, he or she obviously should be dinking around on stuff, or even correlating login times. So if we figure out like this user has a certain pattern of usage on the network and all of a sudden they're logging in at some bizarre time or a bizarre location. Has anyone ever tried to log into Facebook through Tor or a proxy of some sort? Or Google, or really any of your big name things? Give it a go sometime. Yeah, that's a good point. Like if next time you go on a trip, well, I wouldn't actually advise this. Like next time you go on a trip, go plop down at like the hotel lobby computer and try to log into Facebook or something from Google. But I'm not into that. But connect to the hotel Wi-Fi and open a fresh browser and try to do it. You will find that Facebook or Google or whoever it is says like, this is abnormal for you to be logging in California. Because you normally log in from South Dakota and the surrounding region, right? And all of a sudden you just randomly appeared somewhere else. So user activity, stuff like that, Facebook obviously has a pretty good idea of what you're doing at all times, but what if like DSU could do that for you accessing student stuff? Because students' passwords leak. Not that they leak out of DSU, but guess what usually happens? Students use their same password everywhere. Some other vendor gets their passwords compromised. All of a sudden, your DSU account has been disabled because you're sending out spam messages and you don't know why. So if we could figure out a DSU, like all of a sudden you're logging in from an abnormal location that's odd, let's give you some extra login steps to prove that you are who you really say you are. The problem with that, though, is it's really, really hard to do that because it takes tons and tons of processing to pull that off. Or actually, this is another cool one, too. There are log correlation systems that have actually been able to stop CryptoLocker or CryptoLocker variants. What's CryptoLocker do?
Encrypts your hard drives.
Crypts the hard drive on your computer, and what else? Any network shares that are attached to your computer. They love to scan those and lock them and encrypt them too. So if we're doing a really, really good job at correlating access logs coming in, would it be abnormal that you accessed every file on the file share today? If you have a file share at work. You probably access a couple files a day, right? So if we all of a sudden see you grabbing this file, and 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 this file, that's either CryptoLocker is grabbing files and encrypting them, or you are copying the file share and you're about to quit or something like that. So that's a good time to cut the access from that computer and see what's going on. So there hasn't been many stories of success with that, but there are actually a couple out there to where just by reviewing logs, we can set off an alert and stop things in progress. So I'm going to just keep going in the interest of saving time. So there's lots and lots of companies out there that make software that does this. So Splunk is like the data indexing one. The other ones, Alien Vault and Security Center from Tenable, they're like all trying to bring in as much data as they can and start to find patterns from it. And they're all really good in certain areas and then really bad in other areas. And guess what? There is one thing that is super common about all of them. Any idea what it is? They're very, very expensive, yes. So Splunk is actually one of the cheaper ones, which is kind of crazy. So if we look at Splunk, let's go buy it. Now you can download and run Splunk for free. But guess what Splunk limits you to if you do it for free? Yeah, they only let you index so much data in a day. So if we want to go buy Splunk on an annual basis, it's $1,800 per gigabyte a day that we index. So meaning like if we're indexing a gig of data, it's going to cost us $1,800 a year to do it. Or if we don't want to pay an annual fee, then it's $5,400. So let's start to do like, we'll even do 10 gigs. So the price of a perpetual license goes down to $3,000 per gigabyte. So what's this license going to end up costing us? Do the math, 3,000 times 10. So that'd be a $30,000 purchase that you get to make. So pretty expensive. Or you can just pay the annual $10,000 a year kind of thing. So it's a good time, right? I think if you go above 100 gigs, they're like, call us, yeah.
You don't want them.
Yeah, right? So, yeah. It's not exactly cheap. There's a organization. Well, DSU has a academic license, so it's slightly different. Our pricing is weird. But Splunk will always let you go over your limit. You can only do it 5 times in a month, though. That's the magic of it. Is that what you're asking? Oh, yeah, so what we're supposed to do is go buy a bigger license. What I nagged about is, like, there's actually stuff we don't need to log. Like, my crusade is always telnet hits on our firewall. We don't need to log that. What's the telnet traffic coming from?
IoT devices.
Yeah. All these crappy webcams and junk like that connected to the internet. There's services out there and other webcams looking for other webcams. So DSU has a lot of IP addresses. So if there's scanners out there searching for webcams, they hit us a bunch. So it was like 300 or 400 or 500 times a second that our firewall's getting hits for telnet on some sort of IP address. Do we care? I mean, like, at first maybe we did. Like, oh, they're trying to telnet in. No, they're just scanning for webcams. And we're not running telnet on anything. So just don't even log the traffic. Like, we don't even care about that data. So that's how we solved our problem of going over, is started to put in rules that were like, explicitly just don't log this because we just don't care for certain stuff like that. The other weird one is DNS. There's all sorts of DNS attacks where you can make like one DNS server start to recursively query you to death. And so those are really, really common too. So I don't think we log blocked DNS traffic anymore either. But anywho, that's where we'll get into the term a SIEM, Security Information and Event Management System. So those are systems that are meant to put all of it together and have one dashboard for all of your security, and that's kind of the idea behind all of these fun little products. So, does anybody have questions? Another one that you can see sometimes doing stuff like this is Hadoop, but you have to be pretty hardcore if you're running Hadoop for it because you have to do all of the data normalization yourself. Whereas like the nice thing about Splunk is that I can go onto my Splunk account like Juniper, Splunk add-ons. Yeah, see, I've been here. When Splunk is getting data, we have to tell Splunk how to normalize it. So I could sit and write the rule to like, well, if it's a firewall rule, the data is going to look like this and basically go into regular expression hell. Because that's what it is. Or I can wait for Splunk saying, oh, we've got a lot of people sending Juniper data. We're just going to build it ourselves. And then you download the tool that can aggregate the data out. So now rather than me without it inside of Splunk, what you would do is search, like if you search for an IP address, you would actually literally just be doing a full text search of all the data. Whereas with this, I could search for source IP address. And it's just going to search that field of all of the traffic because it will then know what that field is. So that's the normalization part of this. I think it's pretty cool. So we're going to skip logging network traffic or full packet data for now. We'll come back and play with that. So, no questions? Nothing? All right, cool. So we'll see everybody next time, I think.